A logger's shovel strikes something hard, something buried beneath an old tree stump in the Arkansas wilderness. What he's about to uncover has been hidden for 25 years, buried so deep that whoever put it there never intended for it to see daylight again. But here's the thing about secrets. They have a way of clawing their way back to the surface. What Tom Jenkins found that morning would crack open a cold case, a case that had haunted a small town for decades. It would expose corruption and murder in the community's most trusted institution, and it would destroy two men who thought they'd gotten away with the perfect crime. This is the story of Pastor Elijah Freeman, a beloved black minister who vanished without a trace in 1977. He left behind a 17-year-old son and a community full of questions. Did he abandon his calling? Did he take his own life? Or did he simply walk away from everything, including his son? For 25 years, Marcus Freeman lived with these questions eating away at him. 25 years of wondering if his father was a coward, or worse. 25 years of faith turning to bitter resentment. Marcus had no idea that the truth was about to claw its way out of the grave where it had been hidden. And that truth was darker than anyone could have imagined. "25 years later, Marcus Freeman sat alone in his small apartment, channel surfing through early morning television. At 42, he'd become a shell of the faithful young man he once was. When a religious program flickered onto the screen, a preacher delivering a passionate sermon, Marcus felt that familiar stab of pain. He reached for the remote. That's when the phone rang. "Mr. Freeman, this is Detective Sarah Miller. We're calling to let you know we have found something related to your father's case." Marcus almost hung up. After all these years, he'd gotten used to disappointment. "Is this some kind of joke? That case is ancient history. I can assure you this is not a fake call. A logger found a vintage Adidas bag containing a pastoral robe and a Bible with your father's name." Marcus's heart stopped. After 25 years of nothing, actual evidence. An hour later, Marcus found himself being driven deeper into the Arkansas wilderness than he'd ever been. The police car wound through forest roads that seemed to lead nowhere, past trees so thick they blocked out the morning sun. When they finally stopped, Marcus couldn't believe how isolated the location was. Yellow tape cordoned off the area around a massive, rotted tree stump. Police photographers were documenting everything. Workers stood around looking like they'd stumbled onto something they wished they hadn't. Tom Jenkins, the logger who'd made the discovery, was a weathered man with calloused hands and tired eyes. "Morning," he said, shaking Marcus's hand. "Sorry about the circumstances." "Tell me how you found it," Marcus said. Tom gestured toward the tree stump. "Me and my crew were clearing this section when something felt off about this stump. Started digging with a shovel. Excavators are too big to bring this deep into the forest. Eventually found this bag buried underneath." Marcus stared at the stump, trying to process what he was seeing. "How does a bag end up under a tree stump?" "Based on what I can tell," Tom said, scratching his beard, "someone cut down this tree a long time ago, dug a hole beneath the stump and buried the bag. See how the stump's rotted? Makes it easier to dig under. Whoever did this knew what they were doing." They moved to a small tent where the evidence was laid out. Marcus's hands shook as he examined his father's Bible. Despite years underground, the Adidas bag had preserved it well enough to read. On the front page, in the top corner, was his father's name, written in that familiar, careful handwriting Marcus remembered from childhood. "That's definitely my father's," he said softly. But it was the personal note tucked inside the back pages that hit him like a punch to the gut. It wasn't just a prayer, it was a plea. Words about stopping suffering, asking why there was so much evil in the world, begging for help to win against people who try to get me away from God. Marcus's throat tightened. This wasn't the writing of a man planning to abandon his faith. This was the writing of a man under attack. Next, they examined the robe. Detective Miller handled it carefully, noting there was no apparent blood evidence. "If someone had killed your father," she said sympathetically, "we would typically see signs. Perhaps your father was troubled and took his own life." leaving his identity as a pastor behind by burying it in these woods. Marcus shook his head firmly. No, my father was no coward, and if he wanted to get away, either by running or suicide, why would he travel this deep into the forest just to bury a bag? He looked at the Adidas bag again. Something was nagging at him. I never saw my father own this bag. He was a simple man. He wouldn't have bought something like this. Tom Jenkins nodded. It's not a quick task to dig underground this deep and bury a bag this size, especially under tree roots. Even in its decayed state, it would take a single man working alone, a great deal of effort and time. But the biggest question remained unspoken. If these were his father's belongings, where was his father? Marcus stared into the forest around them. Thousands of acres of wilderness, where a body could disappear forever. Someone had gone to incredible lengths to hide this bag in the most remote location possible. But why separate his father's belongings from his body? Why bury them so far from civilization? Unless whoever did this wanted to make sure these items were never found. Standing there in that isolated forest clearing, Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced in 25 years. Hope. Not hope that his father was alive. He'd given up on that long ago. But hope that he might finally learn the truth about what had really happened that Friday night in 1977. He just had no idea how dark that truth would turn out to be. Marcus spent the rest of that day going through his father's belongings at home. Sermon notebooks, personal diaries, everything he'd kept from their old house. His father had been meticulous about record keeping, organizing everything by year in neat collections on the shelf. But something was wrong. The 1977 volumes, both his father's sermon notebook and personal diary from the year he disappeared, were missing. Marcus searched everywhere. His father's bedroom, storage boxes, even places that made no sense. Nothing. If his father was so diligent about keeping records, why weren't the 1977 documents at home? There was only one other place they could be. For the first time in 25 years, Marcus was going back to Mount Olive Missionary Baptist Church. The drive took 10 minutes, but it felt like traveling back in time. The church building looked older, more weathered than he remembered from when he was 17. Back then, it had seemed grand and new. Now it just looked tired. Marcus drew a deep breath before pushing open the door. The interior was exactly the same. Polished wood pews, stained glass windows casting colored patterns across the floor, the commanding pulpit at the front. For a moment, he could almost hear his father's voice filling the sanctuary. An elderly man near the altar turned and smiled warmly. "May I help you, son?" "I hope so. I'm looking for someone who might have known my father." The man introduced himself as Pastor Harold Whitmore. Marcus recognized the name immediately. This was the church owner, the main pastor who had worked alongside his father. "I'm Marcus Freeman," he said, "son of Reverend Elijah Freeman." Pastor Harold's face went through a series of expressions: shock, then something that looked almost like fear, before settling into forced joy. "Marcus, my goodness, is it really you? We haven't seen you since." His voice trailed off. "Since my father disappeared," Marcus finished, 25 years ago. Just then, another elderly man walked in through the back door. "Reverend George Langston," Harold called out. "Look who's here." George's reaction was even more telling. When he saw Marcus, he actually took a step backward, his face going pale. Both men seemed genuinely uncomfortable, exchanging glances like they were having a silent conversation. Marcus explained about the discovery in the forest and how police suspected his father might have taken his own life or abandoned his ministry. "I'm seeking guidance. Do you think my father would have really done something like that?" "You both worked closely with him." The two men were speechless at first. Finally, Harold said slowly, "Your father was always known as a gentle man, a faithful servant of the Lord, filled with wisdom and courage. But no one knows the deepest thoughts of a man's heart," George added quietly, avoiding eye contact. That's when Marcus told them what he was really looking for: his father's missing sermon notes and personal diary from 1977. "I have all the other years at home, but 1977 is completely missing." Harold and George examined the sample notebook Marcus had brought. "We never really saw these," Harold said. "If we had, we would have given them to you or the police back then." They spent almost an hour searching the church office, the library, storage boxes, nothing. But during the search, Marcus noticed how nervous both men seemed, how they kept watching him, whispering to each other when they thought he wasn't looking. As they searched the library, Marcus placed his reference notebook on a table and focused on checking the shelves. That's when it happened. A book on the top shelf caught his attention. It was teetering dangerously close to the edge, like it had been recently disturbed. "I should fix that before it falls," Marcus said, reaching up. "I'll take care of it later," the young staff member quickly said, but Marcus was already stretching to reach it. The book was heavier than expected and slipped from his fingers, hitting the floor with a thud. As Marcus bent to pick it up, he saw the title, Church Financial Management and Stewardship. But what made his blood run cold was the familiar handwriting in the margins, his father's handwriting. Marcus tried to keep his voice casual. "Is this book available to borrow?" One passage was heavily marked. "God sees how we handle his money. Church funds are sacred trusts, and leaders must be beyond reproach." In the margin, his father had written, "Accountability to God first, then to the congregation." As Marcus flipped through the pages, he noticed something else, faint impressions of erased pencil marks. His father had always pressed hard when writing, leaving deep indentations, tilting the page to catch the light. Marcus could make out two names that had been circled and then erased, Harold Whitmore, George Langston, both with question marks beside them. Several sentences about church fund embezzlement were heavily underlined, with notes about dealing with financial impropriety in Christian ways and grace but firmness. Marcus felt sick. Had his father suspected Harold and George of stealing from the church? Is that why their names were written and then hastily erased? He closed the book, his mind racing. Looking up, he saw Harold and George watching him intently, their faces tight with what looked like barely controlled panic. "Thank you for your help," Marcus said, keeping his voice steady. "I should go now." As he walked out of the church with the financial book under his arm, Marcus felt their eyes burning into his back. For the first time since that morning's phone call, he was beginning to understand that his father's disappearance might not have been suicide or abandonment. It might have been murder, and the killers might have just been standing right in front of him, pretending to help. Instead of going straight home, Marcus made a decision he hadn't planned. He turned his car toward the cemetery where his mother was buried. After everything that had happened that day, he needed to talk to someone, even if she couldn't talk back. The cemetery was quiet in the late afternoon. Marcus stopped at a flower shop and bought a modest bouquet, then walked the familiar path to his mother's headstone. Sarah Freeman, beloved wife and mother. He sat on the grass beside her grave, just like he used to as a teenager after both his parents were gone. "Hi, Mom," he said softly. "It's been a while." He told her about the discovery in the forest, about the Bible and robe, about his visit to the church. "I don't know what happened to Dad," he admitted. "All these years I've been angry at him, at God, at everything. But now I just want to know the truth." That's when he heard it. The sound of someone crying. A child. Marcus got up and walked toward the sound, finding a young boy sitting against a tree a few rows away. The kid couldn't have been more than 10 years old, his face streaked with tears. "Hey there," Marcus said gently. "Are you okay? What's your name?" The boy sniffled. Robbie Hark." "Where are your parents? Robbie?" The boy pointed to a nearby grave, and Marcus's heart sank. "Is someone with you, a guardian?" Robbie didn't answer at first, then said, "Please, not home. They don't like me there. My aunt and uncle." The words hit Marcus like a punch. After his father's disappearance, he'd lived with his uncle and aunt too, and they'd made it clear he was a burden. "I understand," Marcus said softly, placing a hand on the boy's shoulder. That's when he felt it, heat radiating through the child's thin jacket. "Robbie, you're burning up. You have a fever. I need to get you home or to a doctor." "Please, not home," the boy pleaded. "Can you take me to your home?" "I can't do that, or I'll get in trouble." "How about the hospital?" The boy's face scrunched up with fear. "Can you take me to a church instead?" The hospital would be better, Marcus insisted. They can give you medicine. When my mom was alive, Robbie said, his voice small, whenever I was sick, she would go to church and ask the pastor for take-home Holy Communion. She would give it to me and pray over it, and I would get better. Marcus's breath caught. He knew about take-home communions. His father used to prepare them for family members who couldn't attend service or were sick. He'd helped him prepare them as a boy. Here's what we'll do, Marcus said. If you agree to go to the hospital with me, I'll get you the Holy Communion from the church and bring it to you there. How does that sound? The boy nodded. As they walked to his car, Marcus suddenly realized something that made his stomach drop. He hadn't seen his father's notebook since leaving the church. With a sinking feeling, he remembered placing it on the library table and never picking it up again. After getting Robbie to the hospital and arranging for his treatment, Marcus headed back to Mount Olive Church. It was getting dark now, and he couldn't reach anyone by phone. When he arrived at the church, it was mostly empty, except for a young staff member who helped him retrieve his forgotten notebook and prepare a take-home communion set. But as they finished up, Marcus noticed something through the side window that made him freeze. Two silhouettes in the cemetery behind the church. He could make out Pastor Harold and Reverend George in the dim evening light, and one of them was holding a shovel. What are Pastor Harold and Reverend George doing at the cemetery? Marcus asked the young staff member. Just blessing the graves, as I mentioned. They should be finishing up soon. But something about their movements didn't look like blessing to Marcus. It looked like digging. He thanked the staff member and headed outside, initially toward his car, but curiosity got the better of him. He decided to walk over and thank Harold and George for their help earlier. As he approached the cemetery, what he saw made him stop in his tracks. Reverend George was shoveling soil onto a mound, while Pastor Harold stood nearby, holding what appeared to be a plastic bag. Neither man noticed Marcus approaching in the gathering darkness. "Good evening," Marcus called out, deliberately making his presence known. Both men jerked their heads up, clearly startled. In the dim light, their faces showed unmistakable shock and fear when they recognized him. "Marcus," Pastor Harold's voice was higher than usual. "What are you doing back here?" "I came back to get my book and pick up communion for a sick child," Marcus said, walking closer. He gestured toward the shovel in George's hand. "What are you doing out here at this hour?" The two men exchanged quick glances. "We were just blessing the graveyard," Harold began. "We noticed this old grave for a deceased dog from the congregation," George cut in quickly. "We got permission from the owner to move the remains because the cemetery space is becoming crowded." Marcus looked from one man to the other, then at the freshly disturbed soil. Moving a pet's grave? At night? To make room in a cemetery? It was the most ridiculous explanation he'd ever heard. "I see," Marcus said carefully. "Sorry for disturbing you." Harold's eyes fixed on the financial book under Marcus's arm. "Is that another book you took from the library?" "Yes, it fell from the shelf. I noticed my father's handwriting inside." George's posture stiffened visibly. After a moment of heavy silence, he said, "Your father was once interested in that book too. Just remember to return it on Sunday." The way he said it sent chills down Marcus's spine. Marcus excused himself and walked back to his car, feeling their eyes burning into his back. Once inside his vehicle, he watched through the rearview mirror as Harold and George remained standing in the same spot, heads close together in what looked like intense, panicked discussion. He was about to leave when his phone rang, the hospital calling about Robbie. But as he prepared to drive away, movement caught his eye. George was loading the shovel and bag into his car, which was parked at the other side of the cemetery. Then he climbed into his vehicle and quickly drove away. Not toward town, but toward the forest roads that led to the mountains. The same mountains where his father's belongings had been buried for 25 years. Marcus made a split-second decision that would change everything. He turned his car to follow George, pulling out his phone to call Detective Miller. Whatever George was planning to do with that bag and shovel in the middle of the night, Marcus was going to find out. "Detective, it's Marcus Freeman," he said as soon as Miller picked up. "Mr. Freeman, is everything all right?" "I'm not sure. I'm following Reverend George Langston from Mount Olive Church. He was digging in the church cemetery this evening with Pastor Harold. They claimed they were moving a dog's grave, but now George is speeding toward the forest with a shovel and a bag." There was silence on the line before Detective Miller spoke again. "Don't pursue him. Mr. Freeman, turn back now. We'll handle this." "I can't just let him out of sight," Marcus argued. "He could be destroying evidence tied to my father's case. I won't turn back until your officers catch up." "If you insist on continuing, maintain a safe distance and do not engage with him under any circumstances. Keep this line open and tell me exactly where you see." Marcus gripped the steering wheel tighter as George's taillights disappeared around another curve. "We're on Mountain View Road now, heading northeast about 5 miles from town limits." As he drove, Marcus shared everything he'd discovered. The financial book with his father's erased handwriting, the notes about embezzlement, Harold and George's suspicious behavior. "The road is narrowing," Marcus reported. "We're climbing in elevation now. There's nothing out here but wilderness and a few lookout points." "Our officers are about 10 minutes behind you," Detective Miller replied. Suddenly, George's brake lights flashed. His car pulled into a small gravel area. "He's stopping at Eagle Point Lookout," Marcus said, parking about 100 yards back. "I'm going to pull over at a distance." Through his windshield, Marcus watched George exit his vehicle, put on a headlamp, and remove the plastic bag and shovel from his trunk. The Reverend walked toward the guardrail, then descended a set of wooden stairs that led to a lower viewing platform along the cliff edge. "He's heading down to the lower trail with the bag and shovel," Marcus whispered. "It's dangerous down there in the dark. The trail runs along the cliff edge with a steep drop to the river below." "Stay in your car, Mr. Freeman," Detective Miller ordered. But as Marcus watched George's headlamp bobbing down the darkening trail, a surge of urgency overwhelmed him. The only reason George would head to that platform was to get as close as possible to the cliff's edge. And with a bag and shovel in hand, he was planning to dispose of something by throwing it into the chasm below. "I need to know what he's doing," Marcus said. "I'm going to try to stall him until your officers get here." "Marcus, do not." But Marcus was already out of his car. Grabbing a flashlight from his glove compartment, he moved swiftly toward the lookout point, following the beam of George's headlamp down the wooden stairs. "Reverend George," Marcus called out when he reached the lower platform. The Reverend spun around, his headlamp momentarily blinding Marcus. When the light shifted, Marcus could see the shock and fury on the older man's face. "What are you doing here?" George demanded. "Have you been following me?" "I saw you speeding out of town and got concerned," Marcus said, moving carefully along the trail toward him. "It's dangerous out here at night. What are you doing with that bag?" George didn't answer. The plastic bag was at his feet, and something solid inside made a distinct thud when it had dropped. "You know, don't you?" George finally said, his voice low and tense. Marcus was still confused. "Know what?" "Don't pretend," George snapped. Marcus felt sick. "We strangled him," George whispered. "God forgive us. We killed him right there in the church basement. Then we wrapped his body in an old robe from the sacristy and buried him in the church cemetery. Not in a marked grave, but underneath an existing pet grave that belonged to a congregation member, hidden in plain sight." The officer pressed for more details. "What about the evidence found in the forest? We were terrified someone would discover his personal items and connect them to his disappearance. So we took his Bible, his robe, and some other belongings, put them in that sports bag, and paid someone to bury them as far from the church as possible. And today," George's shoulders shook. "When Marcus came asking questions, when he found that financial book with our names, we knew it was over. We dug up his remains tonight, planning to scatter them in the river where they'd never be found, along with those journals that proved everything." Marcus walked outside the police station into the cool night air, his legs shaking. 25 years of wondering, of blaming his father, of losing his faith. His father hadn't abandoned him, hadn't taken his own life, hadn't been a coward. He'd been murdered for trying to do the right thing. Standing under the stars, Marcus thought about that sick boy in the cemetery, about the forgotten notebook that led him back to the church, about every seemingly random event that had guided him to this moment. Maybe it wasn't random at all. Maybe his father's fight for truth and justice hadn't ended in that church basement 25 years ago. Maybe it had just taken this long for the truth to finally claw its way out of the grave. That's when the wail of police sirens cut through the night air, echoing off the canyon walls. George's eyes widened in panic. "You called the police?" Taking advantage of the Reverend's shock, Marcus lunged forward and grabbed the bag. Looking inside with his flashlight, his world tilted. It wasn't just soil from the cemetery. There were bone fragments, pieces of a human skull, and underneath it all, 2 books covered in grave dust that he recognized immediately. His father's sermon notebook from 1977 and his personal diary. "You hid these from me?" Marcus asked, his voice shaking with rage. "You were going to throw my father's remains off this cliff?" Police cars pulled into the lookout area above them, their flashing lights illuminating the scene in pulses of red and blue. "Police, stay where you are," Detective Miller's voice called down from above. George looked wildly from Marcus to the approaching officers. With a sudden movement, he climbed over the safety fence that separated the trail from the cliff edge. "No," Marcus shouted, dropping the bag and rushing forward. "Don't do this." "This is better than facing arrest and shame," George muttered, preparing to jump into the darkness below. Marcus grabbed for him but missed. Just as George leaned forward into the abyss, 2 officers who had raced down the stairs lunged forward and caught his arms, pulling him back despite his struggles. "You won't meet your maker so easily," one officer said as they dragged him back over the fence. "You'll face judgment in this world first." As officers secured George in handcuffs, Detective Miller radioed for backup to arrest Pastor Harold at the church. The scene was chaos, flashlights, radios crackling, officers photographing everything. But Marcus could only stare at the contents of that bag, his father's remains, the missing books that would have revealed the truth 25 years ago. "We need you to come to the station," Detective Miller said gently. "We'll need your statement and formal identification of these items." At the police station, the horrible truth finally came out. In the interrogation room, Reverend George had broken down completely. Through tears and sobs, he confessed everything. "Your father discovered that Harold and I had been embezzling church funds," he told the officers. "Over $10,000. When he confronted us privately, we denied it, but he had evidence. Records, receipts, everything documented in that financial book." Marcus listened through the one-way glass as George continued. "Your father gave us an ultimatum. Either confess our sins in front of the congregation and resign from the church, or he would expose us himself the following Sunday. That Friday evening, we met him in the church office one last time, begging him to reconsider." George's voice cracked. The argument got heated. Harold said we couldn't he used a racial slur, couldn't let him destroy our reputations. When your father turned to leave, saying he'd pray for our souls, Harold grabbed him from behind. The processing at the police station took hours, but the truth was finally complete. Pastor Harold, when confronted with George's confession, initially tried to deny everything, but faced with the overwhelming evidence, the financial records, his father's notes, the remains, George's detailed confession, he eventually broke down too. The officer updating Marcus painted the full picture of what had happened that Friday night in 1977. According to both confessions, the detective explained, your father had discovered they'd embezzled over $10,000 from the church fund. But it wasn't just about the money. Harold admitted they deeply resented your father, partly because of racial prejudice, but mainly because he threatened to destroy their reputations in the community. Marcus sat in silence as the officer continued. Your father had given them a choice: confess publicly and resign, or he'd expose them himself the following Sunday. That Friday evening, during what was supposed to be their final discussion, the argument turned violent. They strangled him in the church basement, then buried him under an existing pet grave in the church cemetery. The cruelest irony was how they'd used the community's racial prejudices to cover their tracks. When people asked about the missing pastor, Harold and George had subtly suggested he'd simply abandoned his calling. Maybe the pressure of being a black minister in the rural South had finally gotten to him. The community, sadly, found that explanation believable enough to stop asking questions. "What happens now?" Marcus asked. "They'll both be charged with murder, obstruction of justice, and embezzlement. With George's confession and all this evidence, they'll likely spend the rest of their lives in prison. And my father's remains? Once DNA testing confirms they're his, you'll be able to give him a proper burial." Marcus nodded, feeling a weight lifting from his chest that had been there for 25 years. His father's name would finally be cleared. The community would know their beloved pastor hadn't abandoned them. He died trying to protect them. But first, Marcus had a promise to keep. It was well past visiting hours when he arrived at the hospital, but the nursing staff made an exception when he explained the circumstances. Robbie was awake, sitting up in bed, and looking much better. His fever had broken, and there was color in his cheeks again. "Where have you been?" the boy asked. "I was waiting for you." Marcus sat on the edge of the bed, taking out the communion set. "I'm sorry I'm late, Robbie. Something very important happened, and I had to help the police." "Are you a police officer too?" Marcus smiled. "No, just someone who was in the right place at the right time." Robbie's aunt and uncle were there, looking grateful but confused by this stranger who'd helped their nephew. When Marcus explained about the communion, the aunt looked skeptical. "There's no pastor here to lead the ritual," she said. Marcus met her eyes. "Even though I'm not a pastor and not a perfect man, just a sinner with a lot of flaws, our faith is enough. God is real, and He's always present, watching over our lives." The aunt's expression softened, and she nodded. With careful reverence, Marcus opened the communion set and placed the elements on Robbie's bedside table. He spoke the familiar words of institution that he'd heard his father speak hundreds of times, his voice steady and sure. They broke bread together and shared the cup. Marcus, Robbie, his aunt and uncle. As they took communion in that quiet hospital room, Marcus felt something profound happening inside him. A light returning after 25 years of darkness. A faith that had been buried as deep as his father's remains, finally clawing its way back to the surface. After they finished, Robbie looked at him with bright eyes. "Will I see you again?" "I think so," Marcus replied. "Maybe you and your aunt and uncle would like to visit Mount Olive Baptist Church sometime soon. I have a feeling they're going to need some help there in the coming days." Robbie smiled and reached out for a hug. "I want to be a kind man like you when I grow up," he whispered. As Marcus left the hospital that night, he found himself offering a prayer of thanks, the first sincere prayer he'd prayed in 25 years. He thought about how the day had unfolded, how each seemingly random event had led him closer to the truth. A sick boy in a cemetery, a forgotten notebook, a book falling from a shelf, a midnight chase through mountain roads. None of it felt random anymore. God had used that little boy unknowingly, and because Marcus had chosen to help even in the midst of his own pain, the path had opened that led him to discover the truth about his father's fate. Over the following weeks, as the investigation concluded and the trial preparations began, the full story emerged in the local newspapers. The community was shocked to learn what had really happened to their beloved Pastor Freeman. Many people who had quietly wondered if he'd abandoned his calling now felt ashamed of their doubts. Marcus began planning his father's memorial service, a proper celebration of the man who had died trying to do the right thing. He reached out to Mount Olive's congregation, many of whom remembered his father with love and respect. When DNA testing officially confirmed the remains were his father's, Marcus felt a sense of completion he'd never expected to find. On the day of the burial, the cemetery was packed. People who had known his father, people who had only heard the stories, and people who simply believed in justice and truth. Pastors from neighboring churches came to honor a man who had paid the ultimate price for his integrity. As they lowered his father's casket into the ground, in a marked grave this time, with a headstone that read, "Reverend Elijah Freeman," faithful servant, loving father, seeker of truth. Marcus felt at peace. After 25 years of anger and doubt, he had finally found the answers he'd been searching for. His father hadn't been a coward or a quitter. He'd been a hero who died standing up for what was right. And perhaps most importantly, Marcus had found his way back to faith. Not despite his father's tragedy, but because of the integrity and courage his father had shown in his final days. Standing at the graveside, Marcus looked up at the clear Arkansas sky and whispered, "Thank you for not giving up on me, even when I gave up on you." Sometimes the truth takes 25 years to surface. Sometimes justice moves slower than we'd like. But in the end, evil cannot hide forever. Light has a way of breaking through even the deepest darkness. And sometimes, if we're paying attention, we can see the hand of God working through the most ordinary moments. A sick child, a forgotten book, a logger's shovel striking something in the earth that was never meant to stay buried. The pastor who vanished in 1977 had finally come home, and his son, who had spent decades lost in bitterness and doubt, had found his way back to faith. In the end, that might be the greatest miracle of all.